네, 그럼 바로 다음 순서를 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 이제 본론으로 들어가서요. 귀한 영상을 보내주신 해외 연사 두 분 만나보실 텐데요. 오늘의 첫 번째 해외 연사분은 현재 게임 기반 학습, 게이미피케이션 및 게임적 디자인을 다루는 온라인 매거진 루도고기의 편집장님이십니다. 영국의 사라 르페브르. 게임화를 통한 학습의 진화 발전. 지금 만나보시죠.
Wicked systemic problems such as climate change, ecosystem degradation, racism, inequality and so on, and exploring how organisational systems can be made to work better for innovation, positive culture and even happiness. I'm also the editor of Ludogogy magazine, an online resource for games-based learning, gamification and gameful design, which I'm delighted to say has an arrangement with Gamey Journal, which is published here in Seoul, for the exchange of articles each month. I'm also currently writing a book about a new systems thinking based approach to gameful organisational learning called the Organisational Learning Change Model, which you can see pictured here. And I offer professional development for learning professionals in this and other games-based learning skills and topics. I'm going to talk today about the evolution of gamification in the learning sector. My own particular interest is in adult and workplace learning, particularly in a corporate and organisational setting. But through my work with Ludogogy and the people I've met through that, I've also learnt quite a lot about how games are being used in education, from early years right through to postgraduate level and beyond. Because I've been in games-based learning for such a long time, I feel that my own development has somewhat mirrored the development of the field itself. I've always been a keen player of games, ever since I was a child. We played lots of board games and card games, and family gatherings were always a time for play. When the 1980s arrived, and with it access to console games and magazines containing source code for you to enter and record to cassette tapes, I took all that on board enthusiastically. One of my favourites was The Hobbit, and I spent many hours playing and coding on my ZX Spectrum, which I still own. The real fun play element for me for these games was the fact that they were challenging puzzles to solve. A window should be no obstacle to a thief with friends is a piece of advice I will never forget from the hours I spent trying to escape from a goblin dungeon equipped only with a bucket, a rope and a dwarven warrior, only one of which turned out to be of any help. Text-based adventures like these are composed of branching scenarios. And the trick to winning is finding the correct path through. So it was maybe inevitable when I took to learning that I started working as a tutor, teaching software skills in the early 1990s, and I wanted to introduce a bit of fun into helping students find the right answer, that I turned to these kind of games for inspiration, creating small branching scenario puzzles to test and instruct. In between the times I would be covering theory in a more traditional way with a whiteboard and markers, or demonstrating what I was doing on my own computer with a screen projector. This wasn't games-based learning by any means, and I hadn't even heard of the term at this point in my career. It was an attempt by me to make a somewhat dull and dry topic a little bit more fun for the learners and myself. It was a way of breaking up the learning sessions into different kinds of activities so that people wouldn't get bored, to punctuate periods of reading or listening with short periods of doing. Sadly, as I sit here talking about the evolution of gamification in learning, I still see, 30 years later, that for some people, and that even includes practitioners of games-based learning, we have not moved beyond this very primitive stage. Many people still do not see games and play as valid learning strategies, as pedagogies in their own right, but simply ways of tricking learners into engaging with something they don't find enjoyable. This, to me, is the single most damaging myth about games in learning, and one that I've spent a lot of time and energy addressing over my career. I'm sure that there were people doing research into the usefulness of play in learning settings, but I certainly didn't see that happening with respect to teaching adults in workplace settings. What research was going on was restricting to studying play in education settings, and mostly in early years settings with very young children. This is a situation which is now changing, but its legacy means that games-based learning professionals working now still have to deal with another enduring myth, that games are good for learning in children, but are not serious enough for learning in adults. But of course, there were already some very serious bits of workplace training which were being carried out by the use of tools which were very much like games. Pilots and surgeons and others with very serious jobs where they had to make life and death decisions were already using simulators to prepare them for real-life situations. And in the early 1990s, the idea of the simulation began to appear in organisational learning settings. In particular, this time saw the proliferation of the business simulation in leisure gaming, and eventually this idea was adopted by the more forward-thinking, for this time, learning organisations and departments. It was seen that running a business in a simulation would be a very good way of learning by doing in areas like business finances, investment, strategic implementation, and so on. The increased availability of personal computers no doubt contribute to this. Simulations are reasonably complex, depending on how closely they mimic real life, and nearly all of them, if they can be truly called simulations, require a reasonably complex underlying mathematical model and some computational power. By this time, I too had moved on from doing skills training in software to more soft skills learning, leadership programs, strategic decision making, and as a result I came across quite a few business simulations. Many of these were computer games, but some were tabletop board games designed to be used in classroom settings, and I continued to use both of these as I worked for various learning organisations or departments up until the 2010s. The tabletop games were of necessity less complex, and yet most learning companies who used them would call them simulations. This, I believe, was more about marketing than any reality. The word simulation has a sense of seriousness that the word game does not. After all, they're used by pilots and surgeons. With hindsight, many of the learning sessions I was involved in at this time probably didn't need something as complex as a simulation to successfully cover the learning outcomes. And the tabletop games which aspired to be as serious as simulations were often dull and repetitive as a result. While there are a few properly complex and long-lasting games that I did and still do enjoy playing, Dungeons and Dragons, especially if you're the Dungeon Master, or Twilight Imperium, for example, the era of the business simulation in learning is not something I would wish to return to. Some of the games had so many mechanisms and moving parts in order to simulate reality as much as possible that more time would be spent in a session learning about how to play the game than spent in learning from the game, which defeated the purpose of using the game to learn by doing, because it meant that people were mainly learning by instruction. And what they were learning was how to use the learning tool rather than the intended learning outcome. It also meant that the other alleged benefit of using a game to make the learning fun and engaging was also destroyed, because people were already bored and frustrated before they even got to make their first play. Games that lasted a day or even longer were not uncommon, with repeated rounds of the same decisions tried over and over to see how players' skills improved, as measured by outputs from the simulation. This model of games-based learning also helped to cement another lasting belief about the use of games and play in learning, that the learning does not come from the play itself, but from the debriefing or discussions in between rounds of play. This was an instructional model that ensured that the correct conclusions were drawn by learners and which coached them on what would be appropriate plays in subsequent rounds. As far as I'm concerned now, that arguably wastes the opportunity that learners have if freed to play autonomously to construct their own learning and discover insights. It assumes that learners need to be told what to think and do. What was a game changer for me in my learning practice and how I viewed games generally was a mass participation alternate reality game that ran for 32 days in 2007. 15 years later, the legacy of this game remains, a lasting archive of insights and artifacts created by those who played it, and an eerily plausible record of a fictional future that is very close to now being our present reality. The game has also this year, 15 years after it was played, received the Peabody Award, and I quote, "For its groundbreaking fusion of alternate reality games with serious games and its fostering of creativity and community for the public good." World Without Oil simulated the first 32 weeks of a global oil crisis and invited players to tell their stories through emails and telephone calls. It was some time ago. Blog posts, social media, or whatever other format they wanted. It was not a role-playing game because the parts the players took were their real live selves. All the game asked them to do was to accept the alternate reality that global demand for oil had finally outstripped supply. Each day, the artifacts and insights that the players had created would be reflected back for them, and from the raw material of news and other stimuli about the progress of the crisis. The game was designed and run by Ken Eklund, who was the writer behind it, and Jane McGonigal and other alternate reality experts who were the puppet masters who ran the game. What I realised as I learnt about this game was nothing short of transformative for my learning practice. I realised that games did not have to be content designed by one set of people to be consumed and played by another. Games could be co-created by the players as they were being played. This was something I'd glimpsed when playing Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games, but even those were largely predetermined by the games master before anyone got the chance to play. This game gave me the first insight into what I now recognise as world building, the creation of a premise along with enough detail to establish a framework within which an infinite number of stories can be created, as many different stories as there are players. The autonomy which was given to the players of World Without Oil meant that they spent a couple of weeks telling stories via blogs, phone calls, videos and even comic strips, stories about their difficulties and struggles, businesses collapsing, not being able to take the children to school, having no fuel for a generator and going without electricity, for example. But then something happened. Totally unprompted by the game makers, who gave players channels to play but no instructions as to how they should play, players started to organise themselves. They started to come together and tell different stories, plans for the future, solutions for problems that had been identified, innovations for ways of living in the new normal without oil. About the same time as this game was being played, I came across the work of social constructivists and the idea that learning is a social activity and it is through our shared interactions that new knowledge is constructed. This game and those ideas would inform everything I did in games-based learning from then on. A game I've created this year is a good example of this. The Museum of Impossible Objects is a deck of cards designed to be played either as a game to generate writing prompts in the genres of fantasy, science fiction and weird fiction, or as something deeper. Each card contains a picture of an exhibit in a museum and some text, such as you would see on a label for that exhibit if you visited the museum, describing what it is and where it came from, for example. But these exhibits are far from ordinary. In the world built for the game, fairies are real and exist alongside humans, striving for their rights as sentient beings, as do crows, who are also a sentient race in this setting. There are artifacts from extraterrestrial cultures, and even a captured ghost in a jar. And in this game world, all of these things are true. Also, on each card, there are a set of questions. In the world of the game, the museum itself psychically plants these questions in the minds of visitors. The question can serve as simple writing prompts, or they can be used to start discussions in philosophy, ethics, or critical thinking classes about the more difficult questions we face as humans. a way in which speculative fiction has allowed us to reflect on difficult questions since storytelling began. For example, the ghost imprisoned in the jar invites players to discuss the rights of the sentient dead, which is a reality within the game, and on who should decide from the criteria of imprisoning another being, especially ones who have committed no crime. These are all great prompts for discussions on morality, crime and punishment, and human rights. A game such as this does not have right answers like the business simulations, and it doesn't even have a restriction on how it should be played. The infinite ways to play and the narratives that will emerge are waiting to be discovered. Just as the increased availability of personal computing drove the demand and market for simulation games, the explosion in the board game sector over the past couple of decades has provided both inspiration and challenges to learning professionals wanting to use games in their practice. While in the past, learners may have recognised and been satisfied with the experience of playing something that looked like Monopoly as a business game, or a roll and move quiz as a way to make classroom assessments more fun, we are all more sophisticated now. The rise of the Euro game, light to medium strategy games with heavily embedded themes and many mechanics, set the bar for player experience, and games-based learning practitioners faced a dilemma. They either had to stick to their simple pre-1980s style board games and risk looking a bit dated, not to mention childish, or they had to go all in, learning how to be proper games designers as well as learning specialists. Obviously, this wasn't an option for everyone. But fortunately, a third way has suggested itself, whereby the games designers can carry on doing what they do best, and the learning specialists can provide engaging and pedagogically sound experiences for their learners, without having to learn a whole new skill set. Modding, or the modifying of games, both computer games and tabletop games, has become very popular recently. And while it doesn't require a full set of games design skills on the part of the learning specialists, it does, at the very least, require a level of games literacy. In other words, it is not something you're going to be able to do successfully unless you are a regular player and you make the effort to find out how games work. Mapping a game experience to learning outcomes is the main skill needed. But it's not necessary to find a game which is about your learning outcome. In fact, very often the game's theme is not indicative of what learning outcomes it could be used for. For example, it is unlikely that the game Pandemic will be very useful in training epidemiologists. It has an epidemiology theme, but it wouldn't teach skills of collecting and analysing complex data, or of communicating these in an easily understandable way, skills which an epidemiologist would need. What it is good for is learning around decision-making in a volatile situation, or team working, or strategic planning. The fact that there are now many more resources which take an analytical approach to the study of games make games literacy a possibility for many people. Books such as Jeff Engelstein's Encyclopedia of Game Mechanisms, or Board Game Geek's lists and classification of games by mechanism, genre, and so on, give a great basis for researching suitable games to map to specific learning outcomes. And that kind of brings me up to date with my quick overview of the evolution of the gamification of learning as I have experienced it. Your experiences may have been very different, of course. Where I have got to now is that I've realised in my practice that I want to create games that give as much freedom as possible to the players to create their own learning. In fact, if I looked at some of the most popular and well-known definitions of the word game, it might appear that what I now want to create is play rather than games, giving players the freedom to co-create an experience as they play, rather than laying down a set of rules for how to play or lots of mechanics that guide what happens. I've also found that of all the play experiences which are available, the one which supports this best is the experience of storytelling. And many of the games and play experiences I now make for learners have a focus on allowing a group of people to come together and create a shared narrative. When I look to the future, I'm particularly interested in the new wave of RPG games, using engines like Powered by the Apocalypse, No Dice, No Masters, and Belonging Outside Belonging. Unlike traditional RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons, these are short on stats and dice rolling and big on relationships and shared narrative created by a group rather than created by a games master. I'm also very interested in the ways in which games design itself is being used as a tool for learning. Creating a game requires that you get to know a theme or topic really thoroughly, so asking a group of learners to create a game will lead them through a journey of discovery and deep understanding of a topic, as well as allowing insights into other skills such as systems thinking and design thinking. We are lucky enough to be living in a time of amazing innovation in games and learning, and I can't wait to see what's around the corner. Thank you very much for listening to me today. I just wanted to leave you with a few contact details, as I'm always more than happy to sit and have a chat with people who are interested in games-based learning, gamification and gameful design. You can access my free online resource, magazine ludogogy.co.uk at that address. And if you want to get in touch with me personally, my email address is sarah@ludogogy.co.uk. I'm also very active on LinkedIn, so if you want to connect with me there is my LinkedIn address. And if you want to find out a little bit more about all of the other things that Ludogogy gets up to, the best place to go and have a look is at my Linktree. Thank you again for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
네, 우리 모두는 학습을 합니다. 학습에 대한 여러 가지 관점이 있겠지만 게이미피케이션을 학습에 적용하고 발전시켜온 연사분의 어떤 노력과 연륜이 이 영상에 잘 포함되어 있는 것 같았습니다. 다소 쉽지 않은 내용과 과거의 어떤 해외 사례들도 있기는 했는데요. 유튜브에서 한글로 게이미피케이션 토크라고 검색을 하시면 컨퍼런스가 끝난 후에도 해당 영상을 보실 수 있으니까요. 되새겨보시면서 각자의 영역에서 학습에 어떻게 활용을 하면 좋을지 생각해보면 좋을 것 같습니다.